Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Rupa Subramanya Show. I hope you all had a great holiday season and that it was restful and relaxing and you got to spend time with friends and family, and that 2023 has gotten off to a great start for everybody. Well, today we're off metaphorically, if not actually going to the luxurious ski resorts of Switzerland, in particular Davos, which has become all but synonymous with, guess what, the World Economic Forum. For those who don't know what the World Economic Forum is, it's the leading private club masquerading as an international organization that brings together the world's richest and most powerful people on the planet and tries to exert influence on economic and social policies in all major countries in the world, including Canada. Now, Canada has the dubious distinction of playing an outsized role in promoting the narrative that comes out of Davos. Call it woke capitalism, whether it's called the Great Reset, which aims to put environmental and social concerns ahead of free market capitalism, and as well as the World Economic Forum's insistence on something called stakeholder capitalism, which would be a major departure from our Anglo-Saxon system of shareholder capitalism. What exactly is this strange concept called stakeholder capitalism? Well, according to stakeholder capitalism, basically businesses should move away from what they do best, which is focus on maximizing returns to shareholders, but rather use company resources, to solve social problems like issues related to gender, for example, or identity, the environment, and the list goes on and on and on. The ultimate goal is to maximize benefits to stakeholders. That is basically everybody from the employees to customers, and perhaps even other countries, believe it or not. The fundamental problem with this concept, there are many, many problems. The fundamental concept from a logical perspective is, how does a company balance all of these interests of various stakeholders? There's surely going to be trade-offs involved, right? My interest is not going to intersect with someone else's interest. My interest as an employee will be different from my interest as a customer, for example. So you can see the problem with this. Now, back to Canada. Canada's Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, sits on the board of the World Economic Forum, as does Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada. Carney is now UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, where he's promoting all kinds of net zero emission initiatives, especially as it relates to the banking and finance industry. I pointed this out, the fact that Freeland and Carney sit on the advisory board of the World Economic Forum. I pointed this out in an opinion piece I wrote for the National Post back in February 2021. And really, until my piece, it appears that no one had really pointed to this obvious fact that is literally there on the World Economic Forum's page. So it came as a surprise to many people when they discovered that our finance minister and deputy prime minister was actually on the advisory board of the World Economic Forum. Now, I argued in that column that Freeland's presence on the board subverts democracy here in Canada. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, subversion of democracy is obviously by inference. No one's actually going to say, we're subverting democracy, and you're not going to have a smoking gun of someone actually subverting democracy. It just doesn't work that way. But the point here is that the thought leadership that comes out of Davos punches way above its weight, and it's a small elite gathering of powerful people from academia to business. Freeland and Carney are prominent Canadians who wield considerable influence, not just here in Canada, but internationally as well. At Davos, you'll also find captains of industry and finance, as well as assorted celebrities like Bono, academics, and others, all of whom want to remake our global system along the lines of their shared vision of what they want the world to look like. So why exactly is this problematic, you might ask? For one thing, no one in Canada elected Klaus Schwab, the German entrepreneur and would-be do-gooder, to decide on our policies, whether they relate to climate change, social issues, or anything else. The fact that Freeland sits at the table and presumably shares many of these views is problematic when you consider that, guess what? Her first responsibility is to the people of Canada, who are the only people the government of Canada and its ministers should be working for. As I pointed in my National Post column from February 2021, there's really no problem if Carney sits on their board, since he doesn't hold public office here in Canada. But there's a potential conflict of interest with Freeland, because Freeland is the second most powerful person in the country after Prime Minister Trudeau. Just imagine the optics. Say, the health minister sat on the board of a pharmaceutical company or a tobacco company. Most people would call that out, and the point is it would likely never happen. But somehow the World Economic Forum has, through clever marketing and PR, created this aura around themselves, that there's some kind of an international organization like the UN, for example. But they're not. They're just a private club. It's a by invitation club, and they're pushing their own private agenda, and they're pretty bold about it. They're pretty open about what their agenda is. But the World Economic Forum seems to get a free pass because of its progressive agenda. Things like stakeholder capitalism, Great Reset, are concepts that appeal to the left liberal intelligentsia. But for a second, let's play this back differently. Suppose Schwab and the World Economic Forum were promoting conservative values, for example, free market capitalism, ethno-nationalism. They wouldn't be treated with such deference, right? I don't think so. Now, leaving aside for the moment the conflict of interest issue here, although in my opinion that's a pretty big issue, the usual pushback is, why should anyone care if a few powerful people are gathered for a schmooze fest in the Swiss Alps? Well, it goes back to the subversion of local democracy point that I made earlier. The simple answer is that what happens at Davos helps shape the thinking of political and corporate elites in every major country, and that thinking inevitably becomes part of their mindset. There is no question that the Trudeau government's narrative matches what comes out of Davos. In fact, there's this great example back in 2020 when Trudeau is making a speech at the UN about the Great Reset, and it pretty much reads like something Klaus Schwab wrote, word for word. But let's take a look at the Liberal election manifesto from the last general election. Do you see the term Great Reset anywhere? I've looked for it and I don't see it anywhere. Yet these ideas like the Great Reset and stakeholder capitalism animate our leaders, especially the Liberal Party, and can influence their approach to governing. Freeland herself, when she was a journalist, was a very strong critic of the World Economic Forum. She was an outsider and wrote this amazing book called The Plutocrats, The Rise of the New Global Super Rich and the Fall of Everyone Else, published in 2012. And Freeland makes a very important point here. And she says it's easy to dismiss the importance of these networks, the importance of such gatherings, whether it's Davos or anywhere else. But the impact, and this is a quote from her book, the impact of these networks is much less cynical, much more subtle, though not necessarily of less consequence. So what changed? Freeland did a 180 from being an outsider looking in to as cozy an insider as you can get, and presumably takes a more benign view of the influence of global power elites impinging on local democracy. Let's face it, today, if you're a critic of Davos and you point to the gathering of a few powerful people of the super elite who impose their agenda on the rest of us, you're dismissed as a right-wing lunatic, a conspiracy theorist, when in fact, Chrystia Freeland herself points to the many problems of such gatherings setting an agenda that could potentially subvert local democracy. The irony of that. Anyway, when the World Economic Forum's annual Schmooze Fest convenes next week in Davos, where Chrystia Freeland will be in attendance, I really hope, and I suspect this is a big ask, I hope one of the many Canadian journalists who will be there in attendance will ask her whether it is appropriate for the country's finance minister and deputy prime minister to sit on the board of a private organization. And what led to the 180-degree turn? How did you, Ms. Freeland, go from being a critic of the World Economic Forum to being a cozy insider? The deeper question is, how did all of these people at Davos, which represent not just your garden variety left-wing NGOs or left-wing political parties for that matter, but you have people like investment bankers, fund managers, CEOs of large corporations, even oil and gas companies. How did they go from being red-blooded capitalists who believed in free market ideals to now believing that the profit motive has to be subordinated to social, environmental, and other non-pecuniary goals? There's no doubt in my mind that there's been a cultural shift where many of the elites go to the best private schools, the best private universities and colleges, come out of these institutions with largely progressive views. So when an ex-central banker like Mark Carney, for whom I have a great deal of respect, says that central banks ought to worry about climate change and build that into monetary policy, he seems to really believe in it. A more cynical explanation would be that some of these powerful elites have just taken over this narrative, I think, to better insulate themselves from political pressure. But basically, they keep doing the same thing. They're given a free pass under the cloak of social and environmental virtue. So when we look at the goings on at Davos, you can see it in some ways as a grand PR exercise by the world's power elite, that they do indeed share these progressive values that are currently in vogue. The problem is, if you keep saying you believe in something, even if that's not true, it will eventually constrain how you're forced to act. What we're sorely lacking, in my opinion, at present is a countercurrent. Call it an anti-Davos summit, which promotes the values of individual liberty, free choice, and capitalism. Now, that would be an event I would love to attend. That's it for this week. Thanks for joining me, and hope to see you next week.